You know that feeling when you're juggling work, family, maybe trying to learn something new, and it all just feels like a bit much,
Oh, yeah, definitely.
as if there's this constant undercurrent of stress or just a nagging sense that things aren't quite right.
Mm-hmm. That background hum of, ooh.
Exactly. Well, today we're going to take a step back, way back, in fact, about 2,500 years, to explore some ideas from ancient India that, surprisingly, speak directly to those very feelings.
We're going to delve into the core philosophy of a man named Siddhartha Gautama, who later became known as the Buddha. Now, when you hear Buddha, you might think of religion, and that's, understandable.
Sure, that's the common association.
But at his heart, he was really a profound thinker, almost a kind of scientist of the mind, deeply investigating why we experience dissatisfaction and how we might find a way beyond it.
Exactly. Think of this deep dive as your express ticket to understanding some really fundamental aspects of how your mind works and why you might feel those pressures we all feel.
Right. We've sifted through his earliest teachings to bring you the key insights, those, potential aha moments that can illuminate your own experience.
And hopefully without overwhelming everyone with like super dense academic stuff. We want this
Oh,
to be useful.
that's the goal. To get to the heart of his original insights, we'll be focusing on the earliest collections of his teachings, which are compiled in what's called the Pali Canon. This is a massive collection, often referred to as the Tipiyaka, meaning three baskets.
Three baskets. Okay.
And for our purposes today, the Sutta Pitaka is particularly important. It's like a record of the Buddha's core teachings and conversations with his followers, laying out the fundamental philosophical principles we're going to explore. It's divided into collections called Nikayas, which are our primary source here.
So we're going right back to the earliest available records.
As much as possible, yes. Now, it's true that over the centuries, Buddhist thought has evolved and branched out into many different schools and traditions.
Right, you hear about different types like Zen or Tibetan Buddhism.
Exactly, and they each have their own texts and interpretations. You might have heard of Mahayana Buddhism, for example, which has its own rich collection of sutras, like the Lotus Sutra or the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, often preserved in Chinese and Tibetan. There are ongoing discussions about authenticity and divergence between these traditions, like Theravada, which sticks closely to the Pali Canon, and Mahayana.
And even modern approaches, right, like secular mindfulness, which seems to borrow some techniques but maybe leaves out things like rebirth.
That's right. It's a vast landscape. So, while there's all that richness out there, our goal today, our mission for this deep dive, is to really focus on those foundational ideas found in the earliest Pali sources.
Okay.
We want to unpack the core of the Buddha's philosophical approach to understanding our existence and the causes of suffering in a way that's clear, accessible, and immediately relevant to you listening.
So what's our plan for this exploration? How are we going to tackle this?
Good question. First, we're going to look at what are called the three marks of existence. Think of these as the Buddha's fundamental insights into the nature of reality itself. They're called tilakkhana in Pali.
Okay, three marks of existence. Got it.
Then we'll move on to the Four Noble Truths, Katari Arya Sakani. This is essentially his diagnosis of why we experience this underlying dissatisfaction or suffering.
The diagnosis,
No.
like a doctor figuring out what's wrong.
Precisely. And finally, we'll examine the Noble Eightfold Path, the Arya Ahagikamaga. This is the practical path he laid out, the treatment plan, if you will, for finding liberation from that suffering. It's often called the middle way.
Three marks, four truths, eightfold path. Sounds like a solid roadmap. Where do we start?
Let's begin with those fundamental building blocks, the three marks of existence.
Okay, so the three marks of existence: impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and not self. Anicca, dukkha, anatta. These sound like pretty big, heavy concepts. Are these just like philosophical speculations?
That's a great point. They aren't presented as just abstract ideas to believe in. The Buddha offered them as fundamental characteristics of all conditioned phenomena, basically. Everything that comes into being and exists within this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth we call samsara.
Conditioned phenomena, meaning things that depend on other things to exist.
Exactly. Everything except, potentially, nibbana or nirvana, which is described as unconditioned, beyond this cycle. The key thing is that the Buddha suggested we can actually observe and experience these three marks, these truths for ourselves,
Wow.
through practices like mindfulness and insight meditation, vipassana. It's about developing the capacity to see reality clearly as it is, rather than through the filter of our desires and assumptions.
So it's about direct experience, not just intellectual agreement. Like you have to see it for yourself.
Precisely. Understanding these three marks on a deep, personal, experiential level is considered crucial for gaining true insight or wisdom and ultimately finding freedom from suffering.
And if we don't understand them, if we stay ignorant of these marks,
Then, according to the teaching, we remain caught in a cycle of misunderstanding. Ignorance of vidya about these fundamental aspects of reality fuels craving, attachment, aversion, and ultimately the very dissatisfaction, the dukkha, we're trying to understand and alleviate.
okay, that makes sense. So let's break them down. The first one, impermanence, or anicca. What does that really mean for us in our daily lives? It seems obvious things change, right?
It does seem obvious on the surface, but Anicca goes deeper. It's the universal law that everything that is conditioned sakkara is the Pali term. Everything that arises based on causes and conditions is constantly changing. Nothing stays the same.
Everything. Like, my desk seems pretty solid right now.
Well, at a microscopic level, it's a whirl of atoms. And over time, it will age, decay, eventually fall apart. But Anicca applies even more immediately to our experience. Think about your thoughts, feelings, moods.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, those definitely don't stay put for long.
Right. The Buddha even analyzed what we consider to be a person into 5 basic components or aggregates the khandhas. There's material form, our physical body, feeling, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, perception, how we label things, mental formations, volitions, intentions, habits, biases, and consciousness, awareness itself.
The 5 aggregates, okay.
And he pointed out that each one of these is constantly arising, changing, and ceasing. They're impermanent. So the being they constitute, you, me, is also inherently impermanent, a dynamic process, not a static thing. There's no unchanging essence there.
So the me from 5 minutes ago isn't quite the same me now.
In a very real sense, yes. The collection of physical and mental events is different. And importantly, Anicca isn't just about change happening. It's about the inability to make things stay as we want them.
Okay. That's the crucial link to suffering, isn't it? It's not just that things change, but that they often change in ways we don't like or can't control.
Exactly. We grasp onto pleasant experiences, trying to make them last. We push away unpleasant ones. We want stability, permanence, predictability in a world that is fundamentally flux. And because reality doesn't conform to our desires, because change is inevitable, this clinging leads directly to disappointment, frustration, stress, suffering.
It's like trying to hold water in your fist. The tighter you squeeze.
The quicker it slips through. That's a perfect analogy. A lot of our everyday stress comes from this very tendency, clinging to things, people, ideas, even our sense of self, as if they were permanent. Understanding Anicca, really internalizing it, helps cultivate detachment, not indifference, but a kind of non-clinging acceptance, equanimity.
So it allows us to navigate the ups and downs more skillfully. Less resistance.
That's the idea, learning to flow with the changes rather than constantly fighting against the current. And it's fascinating, as you mentioned earlier, how this ancient insight resonates with modern science. Particle physics showing matter is energy in flux, cosmology showing universes evolving.
Right, the ground beneath our feet isn't really solid in the way we perceive it.
Exactly. So understanding Anicca is a fundamental key. It opens the door to understanding why lasting, ultimate satisfaction seems so elusive. Which brings us to the second mark.
Okay, the second mark, unsatisfactoriness or dukkha. You said earlier is broader than just like intense pain.
Yes, dukkha is a really crucial term, and suffering doesn't quite capture its full range. It definitely includes obvious physical and mental pain, sickness, injury, grief, despair, but it also encompasses stress, anxiety, frustration, unease, dissatisfaction, and just the inherent unsatisfactoriness of being caught in this cycle of constant change.
Inherent unsatisfactoriness. So it's woven into the fabric of existence.
That's the core insight. Because everything is impermanent, Anicca, nothing conditioned can provide lasting, reliable, ultimate happiness or fulfillment. Even pleasant experiences, because they are temporary, have an element of dukkha associated with them.
How so? If something feels good, isn't it just good?
It feels good while it lasts, but the fact that it will end and our tendency to cling to it and fear its ending introduces that subtle layer of unsatisfactoriness. The texts put it starkly. Whatever is impermanent, that is dukkha. It points to the inherent instability and unreliability of conditioned things as a basis for true happiness.
Okay, so the impermanence causes the unsatisfactoriness in a way.
They're deeply linked. Dukkha flows from Anicca, and the Buddha detailed 3 levels or types of dukkha to help clarify this. First, there's dukkha, the suffering of suffering.
That sounds like the obvious stuff.
It is.
Yeah.
Birth, sickness, aging, death, Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, despair, encountering what you dislike, being separated from what you like, not getting what you want. This is the dukkha we all readily recognize and try to avoid.
Okay, that's clear. What's the second type?
The second is viparinama dukkha, the suffering of change. This is the stress, anxiety, and suffering that arises precisely because pleasant experiences are impermanent.
Like the feeling when a great vacation is ending, or
That
knowing that a happy moment won't last forever.
Exactly that. It's the anxiety tied to the instability of happiness itself. The pleasant feeling turns, changes, the parinama, and its passing causes suffering because we were attached to it.
I definitely recognize that one. It's more subtle.
It is. And the third type is perhaps the most subtle and pervasive. Sankhara dukkha, the suffering of conditioned existence.
Okay, what does that entail?
This refers to the underlying background unsatisfactoriness inherent in existence itself, just by virtue of being composed of those five impermanent, interdependent aggregates, khandhas. It's the general stress of maintaining this constantly changing mind-body process, the subtle tension of existence in a world governed by cause and effect, where we're always subject to conditions beyond our total control. It's the lack of any ultimate secure ground within conditioned reality.
Wow. So just being a thing made of changing parts in the changing world has this built-in level of friction, unsatisfactoriness.
That's a good way to put it. Friction. It's the fundamental precariousness of conditioned life. Understanding dukkha, especially these subtler forms like viparinama dukkha and sankhara dukkha, is crucial. It's the illness the Buddha sought to diagnose and treat.
So acknowledging it clearly is the first step, not denying it or pretending everything's always fine.
Exactly. The first noble truth, which we'll get to, is the truth of dukkha. Recognizing it fully, with clarity and courage, is the starting point. It shifts the focus from blaming external events for all our unhappiness to looking at our internal mechanisms, our craving, aversion, and ignorance as the deeper roots.
Okay. Impermanence leads to unsatisfactoriness. Anicca leads to dukkha. Now, the third mark, not self or anatta. This one often sounds the most radical, maybe.
It is quite radical, especially compared to other philosophies prevalent in India at the time, like the Brahmanical traditions that taught about internal, unchanging soul or self, the Atman. Anatta is the direct counter to that. It's the teaching of the absence of such a permanent, independent, controlling I or me or soul.
No permanent soul. That goes against a lot of common belief. How did the Buddha arrive at this conclusion?
Through that same analytical process we mentioned with the five aggregates form, feeling, perception, mental formations, consciousness, he examined each one and concluded. Is form permanent or impermanent?
Impermanent, we established that.
Right. Is what's impermanent satisfactory or unsatisfactory? Dukkha.
Unsatisfactory, too.
Okay. And is it fitting to regard what is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and subject to change as this is mine, this I am, this is myself?
Logically, no.
Mm.
If it's changing and not fully satisfying, how can it be the real unchanging me?
Precisely. He applied this analysis to all five aggregates and found that none of them qualify as a permanent autonomous self. None are fully under our control, none are lasting, none provide ultimate satisfaction. Therefore, none of them can rightly be claimed as myself.
So what we usually think of as me is just this bundle of changing processes.
Yes, the conventional self is understood as a dynamic, interdependent, constantly changing stream of these physical and mental phenomena. It arises dependent on causes and conditions. There's continuity, like the flame of a candle being passed to another, but no unchanging substance that persists.
But again, this doesn't mean annihilation, right? It's not saying I just vanish or don't exist.
Absolutely crucial point. Anatta is not nihilism. It's not saying there's nothing there. It's specifically denying a particular kind of self, a fixed, independent, controlling entity. Some scholars translate it as non-self, not self without essence or lacking intrinsic existence, all pointing to this lack of a permanent core and emphasizing its dependent nature.
Okay, so if anicca is about change, and dukkha is about the resulting unsatisfactoriness, anatta is about realizing there's no permanent manager inside who's experiencing all this.
That's a helpful way to think about it.
Yeah.
And the practical purpose of understanding anatta is profound. Why is this insight considered so liberating?
I guess. If there's no fixed self to protect and promote, maybe a lot of our ego-driven behavior loses its fuel.
Exactly. The illusion of a permanent, separate self is seen as the bedrock of so much suffering. It fuels craving, I need this for me. Aversion, I hate this threat to me. Clinging, this is mine. Conceit, I am better than. Competition, conflict. Seeing through this illusion, even intellectually at first, starts to undermine the basis for all these afflictive emotions and actions.
So it fosters detachment and maybe compassion. If there's less me in mind, maybe there's more connection to others.
Precisely. Less focus on a separate self naturally opens up space for empathy, compassion, and recognizing our deep interconnectedness with all beings. It also frees us from the idea of having a fixed character or personality. If there's no fixed self, then change, growth, and cultivating positive qualities are always possible.
Okay, these three, anicca, dukkha, anatta, they really do seem woven together. Can you quickly summarize how they relate?
Sure, they're like three facets of the same reality. Because things are impermanent, Annika, they are ultimately unsatisfactory, dukkha. And because they are impermanent and unsatisfactory, they cannot constitute a permanent, independent self, anatta. The classic formulation is, what is anicca is dukkha. What is dukkha is anatta.
Impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self.
Correct. And ignorance, avidya, of these three truths is what fuels the cycle of suffering, samsara. Not seeing impermanence leads to clinging. Not understanding unsatisfactoriness leads to endless craving for fleeting pleasures. Believing in a permanent self leads to egoistic striving, attachment, aversion, and conflict.
So the path out involves seeing these things clearly.
Yes, developing insight into these three characteristics through direct observation, primarily in meditation, is the key to dismantling ignorance and ending suffering. It's this experiential understanding, not just belief, that is truly transformative.
And you mentioned modern therapies tapping into this.
Right. Therapies like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MDCT, implicitly use these principles. They help people observe thoughts and feelings as transient mental events, Anika, recognize that fighting uncomfortable sensations often increases suffering, accepting dukkha, and detach from identifying strongly with thoughts, I am not my thoughts, related to anatta, which reduces distress.
Fascinating connection.
Yeah.
Okay, we've looked at the three marks of existence, the fundamental nature of reality according to the Buddha. Where does he go from there? You mentioned a diagnosis.
Exactly. Having described the terrain, he then zooms in on the specific problem of human suffering and its solution. This is laid out in the Four Noble Truths, arguably the cornerstone of his teaching. They were said to be the subject of his very first sermon after his enlightenment.
The Four Noble Truths. Okay,
Yeah.
what are they?
Think of them as a medical diagnosis, a very pragmatic framework. 1. The truth of suffering unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, identifying the illness. 2. The truth of the origin of suffering, samudaya, identifying the cause of the illness. 3. The truth of the cessation of suffering, nirodha, identifying the possibility of a cure, prognosis. 4. The truth of the path to the cessation of suffering, magga, prescribing the treatment.
Illness, cause, cure, treatment. That's very clear. And they're called noble truths.
Yes, Arya Sakani. Arya can mean noble, but it likely refers to the truths understood or realized by noble ones, those who have attained some level of spiritual insight or awakening. They aren't articles of faith, but pragmatic realities to be understood, verified, and acted upon.
Okay, let's go through them. The first noble truth, the truth of suffering or dukkha. We've already talked a lot about dukkha with the three marks.
We have, but here it's presented as the fundamental starting point. This truth states clearly, conditioned existence inherently involves suffering, stress, and unsatisfactoriness. Again, it's not saying life is only suffering or denying happiness exists. It's a realistic assessment that dukkha is an unavoidable part of life as long as we're operating under ignorance and craving.
And it lists specific examples, right?
Yes, the classic formulation enumerates various forms. The suffering of birth, aging, sickness, and death. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, anguish, and despair. Associating with the disliked, separating from the liked, not getting what one wants.
Pretty comprehensive list of life difficulties.
It is, and fundamentally it states that the five aggregates, when they are objects of clinging or attachment, are dukkha. This ties back to sankhara dukkha, the inherent unsatisfactoriness of conditioned existence itself, due to impermanence and lack of ultimate control.
It reminds me a bit of modern psychology concepts like the negativity bias, how we tend to focus on bad things, or hedonic adaptation, how happiness from good things fades quickly.
There are definitely parallels. The Buddha was making a very astute psychological observation. And the crucial instruction for this first truth is that dukkha is to be fully understood, parinya. We need to see it clearly, acknowledge its presence in our lives without flinching, without denial. That recognition is the starting point for change.
Okay, understand the illness first. What's the second noble truth? The origin.
The second truth, samudaya, states that suffering isn't random or imposed from outside without reason. It has identifiable origins, a cause. And the primary cause identified is tattva,
kapanta.
Yes, usually translated as craving, thirst, desire, or attachment. It's this powerful driving force within us that seeks pleasure, seeks existence, and seeks to avoid unpleasantness.
Craving. Okay, is it just one type of craving?
The texts detail three main forms of tacha. 1. Kamatacha, craving for sensual pleasures, sights, sounds, smells, tastes, physical sensations. 2. Pavatacha, craving for existence, for becoming, for continued being, for identity. This can manifest as ambition, desire for fame, or even the deep-seated desire for eternal life. 3. Vibhabhatacha, craving for non-existence, for annihilation. This sounds counterintuitive, but it's rooted in aversion, the desire to destroy or get rid of what is unpleasant, including, in extreme cases, the self.
Wow, so craving covers wanting things, wanting to be, and wanting not to be. That's pretty all-encompassing.
It is, and crucially, this craving, tacha, is said to be rooted in avidya, ignorance.
Ignorance of what? The three marks we talked about.
Exactly. Ignorance or misapprehension of the true nature of reality specifically. Ignorance of impermanence, anicca, unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, and not self, anatta. And also ignorance of how actions lead to consequences, karma, and the process of dependent origination, padakasamuppada. Because we don't see things clearly, we believe permanent happiness can be found in impermanent things, leading us to crave and cling, which inevitably results in suffering when reality asserts itself.
So ignorance leads to craving, which leads to suffering.
That's the basic chain. It's fascinating how modern neuroscience is starting to map out the brain's reward system and how it creates powerful cycles of craving, very much in line with these ancient descriptions.
And you mentioned dependent origination. That sounds important, but maybe complex?
It is very important, and yes, quite complex. Paticcasamuppada describes a chain of 12 interconnected links, starting with ignorance and leading through stages like craving, clinging, becoming, birth, and finally to aging and death, suffering. It shows how things arise interdependently without a central controller. We probably won't dive deep into that today, but it underpins this second truth.
Okay, so the function of the second truth, the origin, craving rooted in ignorance, is what?
The origin of suffering, hatha, is to be abandoned, patadava. We need to identify and let go of these deep-rooted cravings.
Understand the illness, abandon the cause. Makes sense. What's the third noble truth?
The third truth, nirodha, offers the hope, the good news. It states that there is a cessation of dukkha, an end to suffering. If the cause, craving rooted in ignorance, can be removed, the suffering will cease.
So it's possible to be free from this cycle.
Yes. This cessation is nibbana, or nirvana in Sanskrit. Nibbana is the ultimate goal of the Buddhist path. It's not typically described as a heavenly realm you go to after death, but rather a state that can be realized in this very life.
What is Nibbana like then, if it's not a place?
It's often described in terms of what it isn't, the extinguishing of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion, ignorance. It's the cessation of craving, the uprooting of ignorance. The result is profound peace, wisdom, liberation from suffering, and freedom from the cycle of rebirth. It's realized when tanha ceases and avidya is replaced by wisdom, panya.
Extinguishing the fires. That's a powerful image. So it's about removing the fuel, craving, and ignorance?
Precisely. It's about reversing that process of dependent origination by cutting it off at the root, by eliminating ignorance. And the function of this third truth, cessation, nibbana, is that it is to be realized, satchikatthapa. It's an attainable goal.
Understand the illness, abandon the cause, realize the cure is possible. Logically, the next step is
The treatment plan. The fourth noble truth, magga, outlines the practical method, the path to the cessation of suffering. This is the noble eightfold path, Arya Ahaka Magga.
the Eightfold Path. I've definitely heard of that.
It's the core of Buddhist practice and ethics. It lays out the way, magga, to extinguish dukkha and realize nibbana. It consists of 8 interconnected factors that cover wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental discipline.
8 factors. We'll get into those.
Absolutely. But the key point for this fourth truth is that it presents the middle way, avoiding extremes of sensual indulgence on one hand and severe self-mortification or asceticism on the other, both of which the Buddha had tried and found unproductive.
The middle way. A balanced approach.
Exactly. And the function of the fourth truth, the path, marga, is that it is to be developed or cultivated, bhavataba. It's something we actively undertake and practice.
Okay, so the 4 noble truths. Dukkha, understand it. Samudaya, abandon its cause, craving. Nirodha, realize its cessation. Nibbana, magga, develop the path to cessation. It's a very complete framework.
It really is. And they're not meant to be seen as strictly linear steps, but as an integrated whole. Understanding dukkha motivates you to investigate its cause, samudaya. Recognizing that cessation is possible, nirodha, gives you the confidence to cultivate the path, magga. And the very first step on the path, as we'll see, is right understanding, which includes understanding these four truths themselves.
Ah, so it creates a kind of positive feedback loop.
Exactly. It's a dynamic process. And notice how pragmatic and therapeutic it is. It focuses directly on the problem of suffering and offers a practical solution, avoiding purely speculative or metaphysical questions that don't directly contribute to liberation.
Yeah, it really does sound like a doctor's approach. Here's the problem, here's what's causing it, good news is treatable, and here's the prescription.
That analogy holds up very well. It resonates with modern problem-solving approaches in medicine and psychotherapy too. Identify symptoms, figure out the etiology, set treatment goals, implement interventions.
Okay, so now we need to look at that prescription. The Noble Eightfold Path.
Right. This is the practical embodiment of the Fourth Noble Truth, the method for actually walking the walk, extinguishing dukkha, and realizing nibbana. It's the heart of Buddhist practice.
It's called the Middle Way.
Yes, Majjhima Paipada. As we mentioned, it steers clear of the two extremes the Buddha saw as fruitless: the pursuit of happiness through unrestrained sensual pleasures, and the pursuit of liberation through extreme self-denial and harsh ascetic practices.
Both of which he apparently tried himself before his enlightenment.
That's the traditional account, yes.
Okay.
He found indulgence didn't lead to lasting peace, and extreme asceticism just weakened the body and mind without leading to wisdom. So the Eightfold Path is presented as this balanced approach involving moderation, mindfulness, ethical living, and diligent mental cultivation that leads to calm, insight, and liberation.
Makes sense. Okay, so what are the 8 parts, and how do they fit together?
The 8 factors are grouped into 3 main divisions, which are interdependent and should ideally be cultivated simultaneously, not like sequential steps on a ladder. They mutually support each other.
Okay, what are the 3 divisions?
They are 1. Wisdom, panya or prajna. 2. Ethical conduct, sila. 3. Mental discipline, samadhi.
Wisdom, ethics, mental discipline, panya, sila, samadhi.
Correct. Wisdom informs ethical conduct and guides mental training. Ethical conduct creates a foundation of stability and non-remorse, which supports mental discipline. And mental discipline, particularly concentration and mindfulness, allows wisdom to arise and deepen. Trying to develop just one without the others is generally seen as unbalanced and incomplete.
So you can't just meditate your way to enlightenment without being ethical, or just be a good person without developing wisdom.
That's the traditional understanding, yes. They work as an integrated system.
Okay, let's break down the first division, wisdom, panya. What factors fall under that?
2 factors. First, and arguably the foundation of the entire path, is right understanding or right view, samatini.
Right. Understanding. What does that mean? Understanding what?
It means having a correct understanding of the nature of reality as taught by the Buddha. Primarily, this involves understanding the Four Noble Truths themselves, knowing what dukkha is, its origin, its cessation, and the path leading to its cessation.
So understanding the diagnosis and treatment plan we just discussed.
Exactly. But it also encompasses understanding other key concepts like karma, the law of cause and effect regarding intentional actions, impermanence, anicca, not self, anatta, and dependent origination. It's about seeing things as they really are, free from delusion and wrong views.
Is this just intellectual knowledge, like memorizing the concepts?
Initially, it might start intellectually, but true, right? Understanding is a deeper, penetrating insight that fundamentally shapes your perspective and motivates your practice. It's not just knowing about the Four Noble Truths, but seeing their relevance in your own experience.
Okay, so it's the cognitive foundation. What's the second factor in the wisdom division?
The second is right thought, also translated as right intention or right resolve, samasakapa.
Right thought intention. How is that different from right understanding?
If right understanding is the seeing part, right intention is the motivating part. It's about the quality and direction of our thoughts and intentions, consciously cultivating wholesome intentions and actively abandoning unwholesome ones.
What kind of wholesome intentions are we talking about?
The texts specify 3 main types. 1. Thoughts of nakama, renunciation, letting go, detachment from craving and worldly attachments. 2. Thoughts of avihada, loving kindness, goodwill, benevolence towards all beings, the opposite of ill will or hatred. 3. Thoughts of avijhasa, compassion, nonviolence, harmlessness towards all beings, the opposite of cruelty.
Renunciation, loving kindness, compassion,
Yeah.
and abandoning the opposites.
Yes, it involves actively turning the mind away from thoughts rooted in greed, hatred, and cruelty. Intention ensures that our mental energy is channeled towards liberation and the well-being of ourselves and others, aligning our actions with our understanding.
Okay, so wisdom involves understanding reality correctly, understanding and setting our intention toward wholesome goals. Right intention makes sense. What's the next division?
The next division is ethical conduct, sila. This grounds the practice in how we interact with the world and others. It includes three path factors.
Ethics. Okay, what's the first one here?
Right. Speech, samavaka. This involves abstaining from four specific types of harmful speech.
Four types. What are they?
First, lying, musabala, speaking falsehoods. Second, divisive or slanderous speech, psuyavakaya, speech that creates conflict or harms relationships. Third, harsh or abusive speech, varusayavakaya, yelling, insulting, angry words. And fourth, idle chatter or gossip, sampapalapa, frivolous, pointless talk that distracts the mind.
Wow, that covers a lot of common ways we misuse speech. So right speech is about avoiding those.
Yes, and also actively cultivating the positive opposites. Speaking truthfully, speaking in ways that promote harmony and understanding, speaking kindly and gently, speaking words that are beneficial and helpful, and speaking at the right time. Speech is seen as a very potent form of action, karma, with real consequences.
Okay, right speech. What's the next ethical factor?
Right, action, samakamanta. This deals with ethical conduct through our bodily actions. It primarily involves abstaining from three specific unwholesome actions.
Three actions to avoid.
Yes. First, taking life, killing or intentionally harming living beings. Second, stealing adinadana, taking what is not freely given. And third, sexual misconduct, kamasumichakara. The interpretation of this last one can vary, but generally involves avoiding sexual behavior that causes harm to oneself or others, like adultery or exploitation.
Avoid killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. Are there positive aspects too?
Definitely. Right action also encourages actively engaging in compassionate and helpful deeds. For lay practitioners, these first two sila factors, speech and action, are often summarized in the 5 precepts, panyakasila, which add abstaining from intoxicants that cause heedlessness. Some interpretations also extend right action to cultivating healthy lifestyle habits that support well-being.
Okay. Speech, action. What's the third factor in ethical conduct?
Right. Livelihood. Sama eva. This extends ethical considerations to how we earn our living. It means choosing a profession or way of making money that is honest and does not cause harm to oneself or others.
Earning a living ethically. What kind of jobs should be avoided, according to this?
The traditional texts list specific livelihoods to avoid, such as those involving trading in weapons, living beings, like slavery or raising animals for slaughter, meat or butchery, poisons, and intoxicants.
So, professions that directly cause harm or suffering.
Exactly. The principle is to engage in work that aligns with ethical values, contributes positively or at least neutrally, and avoids exploiting or harming others or the environment. It encourages sufficiency and warns against greed-driven occupations.
This feels very relevant today, with discussions about ethical business, corporate social responsibility, environmental impact.
Absolutely, right. Livelihood provides a framework for evaluating our career choices and the ethical implications of economic systems. It bridges personal practice and social responsibility. Thinkers like E.F. Schumacher drew on this for concepts like Buddhist economics, emphasizing well-being over mere profit.
Okay, so ethical conduct, sila, covers our speech, actions, and livelihood. What's the third and final division of the path?
The third division is mental discipline or mental cultivation, samadhi. This focuses on training the mind itself. It also has 3 path factors.
Training the mind. How do we do that? What's the first factor?
Right, effort, samavayama. This isn't just about trying hard in general, it's about specific, focused, and energetic effort directed towards cultivating a wholesome mind.
Specific effort. Like what?
The texts describe 4 specific practices, often called the 4 great efforts. 1. The effort to prevent unwholesome mental states, like greed, anger, delusion, that haven't yet arisen. 2. The effort to abandon unwholesome states that have already arisen. 3. The effort to arouse wholesome mental states, like kindness, mindfulness, concentration, that haven't yet arisen. 4. The effort to maintain and develop wholesome states that have already arisen.
Prevent the bad, abandon the bad, arouse the good, maintain the good. That's very practical.
It is. It requires active engagement of the will, vigilance, and persistence in purifying the mind and directing it towards liberation. It's the engine driving the practice.
Okay, right effort. What's next in mental discipline?
Next is right mindfulness, samasati. This is probably the most well-known factor in the West today, thanks to the modern mindfulness movement.
Mindfulness, so paying attention.
Yes, but specifically, maintaining clear awareness of present moment reality, what's happening right now, inside you and around you, without judgment, clinging, or aversion. It's about cultivating moment-to-moment attention.
Awareness of what, exactly?
The primary framework for cultivating right mindfulness is the four foundations of mindfulness, Satipatthana, as laid out in key texts like the Satipatthana Sutta. These are 1. Mindfulness of the body, Kayanupassana, awareness of breath, body postures, physical sensations. 2. Mindfulness of feelings or sensations, Vedanupassana, awareness of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral feelings as they arise and pass away. 3. Mindfulness of the mind or consciousness, Cittanupassana, awareness of mental states like greed, anger, calm, distraction, concentration, etc. 4. Mindfulness of mental objects or phenomena, Dhammanupassana, awareness of the contents of the mind in relation to Buddhist teachings, such as the five hindrances, the five aggregates, the factors of enlightenment, or the Four Noble Truths themselves.
Body, feelings, mind states, mental objects. That's a very thorough way to observe experience.
It is. The practice develops clarity, insight into the nature of experience, especially anicca, dukkha, anatta, and detachment from habitual reactions. It's a core meditative training. Another key text here is the Anapanasati Sutta, focusing on mindfulness of breathing.
Okay. Effort, mindfulness. What's the final factor of the Eightfold Path?
The final factor is right concentration, sama samadhi. This refers to the practice of developing deep mental concentration, focus, or one-pointedness, typically through formal meditation techniques.
Concentration, like focusing the mind.
Exactly. As the mind becomes progressively more stable and free from distractions through training, it can enter states of profound calm, clarity, and absorption known as jhana.
Jonah, what are those?
They are meditative states of deep tranquility and unification of mind. The texts describe four main levels of material jhana, characterized by increasing calm and equanimity, and sometimes four immaterial jhanas, which are even more refined states of concentration.
And what's the purpose of achieving such deep concentration?
A stable, concentrated mind, samadhi, provides the necessary foundation for developing penetrating wisdom, panya, into the true nature of reality, seeing anicca, dukkha, and anatta directly and clearly. Mindfulness might reveal the arising and passing moments, but deep concentration allows the mind to stay steady enough to see their fundamental characteristics without being swept away.
So concentration supports mindfulness and wisdom.
Yes. Samadhi provides the stability, sati provides the clear awareness, and panya provides the understanding and insight. They all work together.
Wisdom, understanding, intention, ethics, speech, action, livelihood, mental discipline, effort, mindfulness, concentration. That's the Eightfold Path. It really covers a lot of ground: how you think, how you act, how you train your mind.
It's a comprehensive path for transforming one's entire being, aimed at the complete cessation of suffering. The three divisions support and reinforce each other continuously.
It's quite remarkable how these ancient insights seem to offer such a structured approach. How do these ideas land in our modern world? Are they still relevant?
Hugely relevant, I'd say. The core philosophical techniques and insights of the Buddha seem incredibly adaptable and continue to resonate deeply with contemporary challenges. We see applications in mental health, ethics, social action, even business.
You mentioned mindfulness earlier. That seems like the most obvious connection point for many people today.
Absolutely. Mindfulness, samasati, and concentration, samasamadhi, often bundled together in meditation practices, have gained widespread recognition, largely outside of a strictly Buddhist context, for their potential to alleviate modern forms of suffering.
Like stress, anxiety, depression. That seems to be where a lot of the focus is.
Exactly. There's a growing body of research, including numerous studies and meta-analyses, suggesting that mindfulness-based interventions, or MBIs, can be effective in reducing symptoms of stress, anxiety, and depression across various populations.
What kind of populations?
People dealing with chronic stress, anxiety disorders, preventing depression relapse, coping with cancer diagnoses, chronic pain, heart disease, even substance use recovery. The applications are really broad.
Are there specific findings?
Yes. For instance, some meta-analyses show moderate effects of mindfulness-based therapy on anxiety and mood symptoms, with perhaps larger effects for people with diagnosed conditions. Studies on mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, have shown effectiveness for healthcare professionals in reducing their stress and burnout and increasing self-compassion. Others show MBSR having moderate effects on depressive symptoms in adolescents and young adults.
That's quite compelling. Are there caveats?
Of course, research always has limitations, methodological variations between studies, potential publication bias, the need for more high-quality long-term trials, but the overall trend is positive and points towards genuine benefits for mental well-being.
And these MBIs, like MBSR and MBCT, they directly incorporate these Buddhist practices.
Yes, they form the core. MBSR, developed by John Kabat-Zinn initially for chronic pain and stress, is typically an 8-week program involving formal practices like body scans, sitting meditation focusing on breath and sensations, mindful movement, and informal practices integrating mindfulness into daily life.
And MBCT.
Mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, developed by Segal, Williams, and Teasdale, specifically integrates MBSR practices with elements of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. Its primary aim was to prevent relapse in people with recurrent depression. It teaches participants to relate differently to their negative thoughts and feelings, to see them as transient mental events rather than facts about reality. This is often called decentering.
Decentering. That sounds related to the not-self idea, anatta.
Very much so. And other third-wave psychotherapies also incorporate these principles. Acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, developed by Stephen Hayes and colleagues, emphasizes psychological flexibility, accepting difficult thoughts and feelings rather than struggling with them, clarifying personal values, and committing to actions aligned with those values. It has strong parallels with accepting dukkha, practicing mindfulness, and deconstructing the rigid self-concept. ACT talks about self as context.
DBT.
Dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, developed by Marcia Linehan primarily for borderline personality disorder, explicitly includes mindfulness as one of its core skills modules, crucial for developing emotional regulation and distress tolerance.
So how do these therapies actually work through the lens of those three marks we discussed?
Well, mindfulness practice cultivates that direct experiential recognition of Annika seeing how thoughts, feelings, and sensations constantly arise and pass away. This helps people detach from clinging to pleasant states or fighting unpleasant ones.
Reducing the struggle.
Exactly. It also fosters a greater acceptance of discomfort and difficulty as inherent parts of life, dukkha, reducing the secondary suffering that comes from resisting or judging the primary pain.
Okay.
And by observing thoughts and feelings simply as transient mental events rather than identifying with them completely, people cultivate a more flexible, less solid sense of self, anatta. This decentering allows for more psychological freedom and less reactivity.
So anicca, dukkha, anatta are kind of the mechanisms of change, even if not explicitly named.
You could definitely argue that. And preliminary neuroscience research is starting to explore the physical correlates. Some studies suggest meditation practice might lead to changes in brain structure and function.
Like what kind of changes?
Things like increased cortical thickness in brain areas associated with attention and interception, awareness of internal body states, reduced reactivity in the amygdala involved in fear responses, and altered activity in the default mode network, often associated with mind-wandering and self-referential thought. These changes might correlate with decreased rumination and increased compassion, but again, it's an emerging field.
Fascinating potential links.
Hmm.
Beyond mental health, how do Buddhist ethics apply today? That seal a part of the Eightfold Path.
Buddhist ethics offer a robust framework for navigating modern moral landscapes. The core principles are non-harming, ahimsa, compassion, karuna, and loving-kindness, metta. The concept of karma underscores moral responsibility, and intention is considered paramount. It's very much a virtue ethics approach, focused on cultivating wholesome character traits.
How does that translate to specific modern dilemmas, like in bioethics? That field seems full of tricky questions.
It does, and Buddhist scholars and practitioners have been engaging with bioethics since at least the 1980s. Applying principles like non-harming and compassion to complex issues often requires careful interpretation, and there's a diversity of views within Buddhism itself.
For example, what about something like abortion?
That's a contentious one. Some Buddhist perspectives emphasize the principle of non-injury and the potential consciousness of fetal life, leading to a stance against abortion. Others give more weight to intention and circumstances, potentially allowing for compassionate exceptions, though this is often debated. There isn't one single monolithic Buddhist view.
What about end-of-life issues, like euthanasia?
Generally, the strict emphasis on non-harming opposes active euthanasia or assisted suicide. However, the emphasis on compassion for the dying, promoting a peaceful death, and accepting impermanence might support decisions like withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatment in terminal illness, or even, in some interpretations, allowing a terminally ill person to voluntarily stop eating and drinking. Again, nuances abound.
Other areas? Organ donation, genetic enhancement.
Organ donation is debated, often centering on determining the exact moment consciousness ceases. Genetic enhancement raises concerns about potentially increasing suffering through unintended consequences, fostering self-centered desires, and whether it aligns with interdependence and the potential for enlightenment for all. Scholars like Damien Kuhn, Pinet Ratanakul, Masahiro Taniguchi, and Rupert Gethin have written extensively on these topics, and journals like the Journal of Buddhist Ethics foster this discussion.
And what about ethics in the workplace?
No.
Right, livelihood.
Right livelihood, Sama Eva, provides that direct ethical framework. Avoid jobs that cause harm. Earn honestly. In modern terms, this clearly relates to ideas of corporate social responsibility, fair labor practices, environmental sustainability, avoiding manipulative advertising or financial practices.
The Buddhist economics idea you mentioned.
Yes, it critiques the modern obsession with relentless economic growth and profit maximization, advocating instead for sufficiency, human well-being, and minimizing harm. Principles like compassion and interdependence encourage businesses to consider the impact on all stakeholders, employees, customers, communities, the environment, not just shareholders. Some companies even use mindfulness or loving-kindness training to foster more ethical behavior and positive work environments.
So it's about bringing those ethical principles right into the economy. That leads naturally into another area, applying these ideas to broader societal issues.
Exactly. That's the domain of what's often called engaged Buddhism. This is a dynamic movement really gaining prominence in the latter half of the 20th century that explicitly applies Buddhist teachings, mindfulness, compassion, interdependence, nonviolence, to address social, political, economic, and environmental suffering in the world. It marks a shift from a predominantly inward focus to actively engaging with collective suffering.
Who are some key figures associated with engaged Buddhism?
Perhaps the most famous is the Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, who actually coined the term engaged Buddhism during the Vietnam War, advocating for mindfulness as a basis for peace work. Others include the Dalai Lama, B.R. Ambedkar in India, who used Buddhism to challenge the caste system, Suluk Varaksa in Thailand, and A.T. Aryaratne, founder of the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement in Sri Lanka.
What philosophical ideas drive this engagement?
The Bodhisattva ideal, particularly strong in Mahayana Buddhism, is a major inspiration. The ideal of working selflessly for the liberation of all beings from suffering. This naturally extends compassion beyond individual practice into social action.
So activism rooted in compassion.
Yes, and nonviolence. Engaged Buddhists have been active in peace movements, human rights advocacy, racial justice, gender equality efforts, poverty relief, and interfaith dialogue. Activism is seen not as separate from practice, but as an expression of it, challenging structural violence and injustice out of compassion and a commitment to non-harming. Thich Nhat Hanh's work during the Vietnam War is a prime example.
He also formulated specific guidelines, didn't he?
Yes, his 5 mindfulness trainings are a beautiful reformulation of the traditional 5 precepts into positive guidelines for mindful living and social action. They focus on reverence for life, true happiness, generosity, avoiding exploitation, true love, responsible sexual conduct, protecting children, loving speech, and deep listening, and mindful consumption, nourishing body and mind, transforming violence.
That really connects personal practice with societal impact. What about environmentalism?
That's a huge area for engaged Buddhism. The core Buddhist doctrine of interdependence, paticcasamutpada, or interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully termed, it provides a powerful foundation for environmental ethics.
Interbeing, meaning everything is connected.
Exactly. If everything arises together and is mutually dependent, then harming the environment is harming ourselves. This understanding motivates mindful consumption, protecting natural resources sometimes through actions like tree ordination ceremonies in Thailand, promoting vegetarianism, challenging consumerism, and advocating for sustainable practices. Eco-Buddhism explicitly links spiritual practice with ecological awareness and action. It highlights how personal well-being, social justice, and ecological health are all deeply interconnected.
It seems Buddhism offers a very holistic worldview. But what about people who are drawn to the practices like meditation, but maybe not the whole philosophical or religious framework like rebirth or karma?
Yeah.
You mentioned secular perspectives earlier.
Yes, that's another significant modern development, particularly in the West. Secular Buddhism adapts Buddhist philosophy and practices, especially meditation, for a non-religious or secular audience. It often involves reinterpreting or setting aside elements traditionally considered religious, like rebirth, karma in its cosmological sense, deities, or complex metaphysics.
Who are some proponents of this approach?
Figures like Stephen Batchelor are prominent. He emphasizes Buddhism as a path for human flourishing in this life, focusing on core pragmatic teachings like conditionality, related to dependent origination, the Four Noble Truths, reframed as four tasks, embrace life, let go of reactivity, see stopping, cultivate path, mindfulness, and ethical living, grounded in experience rather than dogma. Robert Wright, in his book Why Buddhism is True, makes a case from evolutionary psychology and neuroscience for the validity of the Buddhist diagnosis of the human predicament and the efficacy of meditation.
What's the appeal of this secular approach?
It resonates with people who find the psychological insights and ethical guidelines of Buddhism compelling, but are skeptical of religious doctrines or supernatural claims. It offers practical tools for stress reduction, emotional regulation, and living an ethical life grounded in reason and empirical observation. It can be a more accessible entry point for many.
Are there criticisms?
Oh, yes. This approach faces significant criticism from many traditional Buddhists and scholars. They argue that removing concepts like rebirth and karma fundamentally alters the Buddhist worldview and reduces its scope from liberation across lifetimes to simply improving well-being in this life. There were concerns about mindfulness being decontextualized and commodified, sometimes called McMindfulness, stripped of its ethical and wisdom foundations.
So concerns about authenticity and maybe even cultural appropriation.
Exactly. Some critics see it as a form of Western ethnocentrism, reshaping Buddhism to fit secular modern sensibilities. There's an ongoing debate about whether secular Buddhism represents a legitimate evolution or a misrepresentation of the Buddha's core teachings, especially regarding things like rebirth, which seem quite central in the early texts. Proponents argue they are recovering a pragmatic, empirical core, while critics argue key elements are being ignored or distorted.
It's clearly a complex and evolving landscape.
It absolutely is. These modern applications, from therapy to social action to secular interpretations, really show the dynamic and adaptable nature of Buddhist thought. While specific techniques like mindfulness can certainly be extracted and used effectively, the deeper philosophical framework, the three marks, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path offers a much more comprehensive vision for understanding ourselves and transforming our lives. And that principle of interdependence, paticcasamutpada, or interbeing, seems to be a powerful thread connecting the psychological, ethical, social, and ecological dimensions.
That's a fantastic overview. We've covered so much ground, from the core ideas 2,500 years ago to how they're showing up right now.
It's been a rich exploration.
So just to quickly recap for everyone listening, we started with the Buddha's fundamental view of reality. Through the three marks of existence, everything is impermanent, anicca, inherently unsatisfactory in a deep sense, dukkha, and lacks a permanent, independent self, anatta.
Right, the basic characteristics of conditioned life.
Then we move to the Four Noble Truths, the core diagnosis. Acknowledging dukkha, understanding its origin and craving fueled by ignorance, samadaya. Realizing that cessation of suffering is possible, nirodha or nibbana, and knowing the path to achieve that, magga.
The illness, the cause, the cure, the medicine.
And that medicine is the Noble Eightfold Path, the practical guide covering wisdom, right understanding, right intention, ethical conduct, right speech, right action, right livelihood, and mental discipline, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration.
The comprehensive program for transformation.
And we've seen how these ancient insights remain incredibly relevant, popping up in modern psychology and therapy, providing ethical frameworks for complex issues in bioethics and business, fueling movements for social justice and environmental action through engaged Buddhism, and even evolving into secular forms.
It really speaks to the enduring power and practicality of these core philosophical techniques for understanding our minds and navigating the complexities of life.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about. And maybe as a final thought for everyone listening, considering that deep interconnectedness, that inner being we touched upon, perhaps ask yourself, what's one small shift you could make, maybe even today, in how you relate to yourself or others, or even just your environment, to cultivate a little more awareness or compassion?
That's a wonderful closing reflection. It doesn't have to be monumental. Small shifts matter.
Exactly. And if this deep dive has sparked your interest, there's so many resources to explore further, from translations of the Pali Canon itself, like the Nikayas we mentioned, to contemporary writings on mindfulness, ethics, and engaged practice. This has really just been a starting point.
A rich tradition awaits further exploration.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the Buddha's core philosophy. We hope these insights prove valuable as you continue navigating your own path.
Thanks for listening, everyone.